Thank you everybody for joining us for our today's BioRAFT EHS community webinar. Today we're going to be talking about getting EHS a better seat at the table. Our panelists today are Liz Clark and Corey Martin. Unfortunately, Rob and Izzo was called away to a very important meeting. It's one of the things that happens sometimes when you have a seat at the table is you get called to ask and get that filled. But she left us some very useful information. I'll be sharing that with everybody after the webinar, posting a PDF of it. And just as a quick reminder and heads up to everybody, in addition to Zoom having the chat function, it also has a really helpful Q&A function. If you go down to your menu bar and toolbar and click on that Q&A button, you will be able to go and open the Q&A, and there you'll be able to ask questions to our panelists. If you see a question that somebody else has asked that you think is interesting, you can thumb that up and it'll kind of float it to the top, give us an easier time of identifying what we should talk about. And you can also have side conversations. You can respond to each other's questions and have some back and forth chatter. So you're not just limited to what the three of us are talking about at any given moment. You can just talk about what is interesting to you or, ask for more clarification. So without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists here. Ask them to give a brief introduction and talk about their background, and then we'll jump on into our prepared questions before the live Q&A portion here. So Liz, would you mind kicking us off?
Sure. So currently I'm working at Northeastern University as the assistant director focused on research safety programs. Previously, I've worked in the private sector at EMD Serono as a senior safety specialist. And so basically I was working as a biosafety program manager at Northeastern for a number of years. And I took a sabbatical from Northeastern to go to the private sector, and then I came back. So academia is kind of, I guess, where my heart has remained. So I'm back there. So again, my areas of expertise are mainly in biosafety and expanding into all of research and lab safety. And that's pretty much me.
All right, and Corey.
Sure. Yeah, so I'm the founder and CEO of Spotlight Safety. I've been a safety professional, for the better part of the last decade. And really, I'm a scientist by background. I was pre-med in college, really wanted to, and then kind of transitioned into the research world and, was going to be a liberal arts professor. And after seeing years of the research world and the grant-based career, I took a sidetrack and got into EHS through being the research safety officer at Dartmouth College. It was a great way to see a lot of different elements of environmental health and safety. I was basically the assistant everything officer, assistant biosafety officer, assistant chemical hygiene officer. I sat on the panels. It was really a good eye-opening experience into what the safety world is beyond the annual inspection, when you're at the bench and viewing safety professionals as the safety cop and the kind of, watch out police. But I got a much better sense of, what goes into the hazard controls and decision-making process and reviewing the science and, the trades and the engineering school and whatnot. So it was great to see that, and it really opened my eyes up to what being a safety professional was all about. And from there, I transitioned into being a safety consultant in the greater Boston biopharmaceutical world. Life sciences industries also have helped groups in manufacturing and some tech R&D spaces. I made a quick pivot, and part of my business now is helping craft breweries and distilleries with EHS operations as well. So I try to consider myself a generalist, but my experience and background really lends me more toward the biosafety and advanced viral vector type spaces.
Great. And just to, kind of frame our conversation today and, what we'll really be trying to hit upon and drive towards and help you out with is this idea that right now during COVID, almost any decision that gets made at a large scale organizational or institutional level is a safety decision. It affects people being in the same places, which means that COVID risk is there. And certainly I think we're all seeing in our day-to-day lives that many folks have not had to really deal with risk management and risk assessments at a personal level and in a more structured way. And of course, that's our bread and butter here. And it's just a great opportunity for safety professionals to bring what they know in to help avoid issues that could be prevented and, otherwise problem solve and figure out, okay, how can we build those relationships that'll really get these opinions heard. So let's go ahead and kick things off here. So Liz, first question is going to come towards you. So have you found any effective empirical ways to show that safety is a valuable resource for your organization? I know that data can sometimes be one of those really hard things to come by where you can point to numbers. So what have you found has worked?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, in cases where we saw gaps that we needed to fill, a good example from my background is our lab coat program. We didn't have a campus-wide program. The solutions that were being used were not the solutions we wanted used. And so it was a case of getting together with the key stakeholders on the campus to really understand the different areas that impacted. So building those relationships with the key stakeholders was really important, really defining what the problems are and the potential solutions, but the metrics are really important. Understanding, the number of people impacted and basically, all that information around the problem is really important. And so our way at Northeastern, at least in the past, and I guess more recently as well, is to articulate all the gravity of the problem, the potential solutions, the impact, costs in a white paper. And so you basically work through making the case, a business case, a safety case, bringing in those key stakeholders into the conversation and into the process to come up with a product with an executive summary that can go up the food chain. And it's worked for us in several cases, but the best case to talk about would be the lab coat program. So just, getting those key stakeholders involved in the process, part of the discussion and on board. We went through the process of drafting a white paper and getting buy-in from our safety committees and other key stakeholders, department safety officers, department chairs, and then sending it up the food chain, like I said, with all of that backing. And it kind of creates a situation where you don't get a no because you have buy-in across the board, and always funding is the issue. But, we navigated that hurdle and managed to get a comprehensive campus-wide lab coat program off the ground, which was pretty amazing. So, and everyone's benefiting now, so it's good.
Yeah, if the funds for an accident aren't there, then they really should be there for the prevention, right?
Right.
So it sounds like the real attitude there was, okay, let's not just drop something onto somebody's desk unseen here. Let's have it be something where they've been involved, they've had their opportunity to weigh in, they really understand the process. So that way, when it actually is fully presented, it feels like something they have a stake in as well.
Exactly. Ownership. It's so key to make people own it with you. That's a really good point that you had.
Great. And, of course, throughout the course of the discussion, if either of you would like to jump in, piggyback off each other's points, you're welcome to. But otherwise, I can just keep on going here with these questions. And Corey, next one is coming over to you. I was curious about how you justify upfront safety program expenses and kind of shift the conversation from this theoretical long-term savings, where it's very sort of hand-wavy, a little bit hard to kind of make more concrete, and then turn that into, like I said, more concrete gains in efficiency, productivity, overall value, and base that more in reality.
Yeah, so there are definitely different ways to think about this and certainly different contexts where this would come up. But I do think it's really important to give some concrete value beyond, yay, we're going to avoid theoretical OSHA fines in the future. And that's something that I think a lot of people will default to, and it's more the fear-based strategy for managing safety. And I really try to get groups to work away from fear-based safety and really more toward proactive, how do we define safety culture as part of the overall work culture? How do we make this a good place to work beyond, yeah, everyone has to wear, PPE. And if they don't, they're going to get in trouble. To, how can we collectively build a culture where that's just the norm? And, it's something where you go and you follow safety procedures because that's what everyone does. And, I think it really depends on the background of the overall program. And it's a lot easier for, early stage companies to start from scratch on those safety program elements, as opposed to maybe an academic institution who has, professors who are still there from the 70s, and they remember when mouth pipetting was normal, and when smoking in the lab wasn't something that people scoff at during safety training. So I think it's really shifting toward more upfront value, and I view it as, again, a portion of the overall company culture. But also, when you're dealing with early stage companies, there are elements of, operational start dates and how quickly you can get productivity going. And if you have, safety issues that lead to, equipment shutdowns because it wasn't managed or maintained properly, those are all elements of the safety program that provide very real value. And I think there are other elements too, where I've worked very closely in the past with insurance companies, and they're very willing to offer insurance credits to companies who put in compliant safety programs up front. I've worked with a lot of venture capital groups who want to protect their investment, and if they see something that's worth investing, it might be something that's more attractive for investment. So there are a lot of elements that are beyond just the theoretical long-term savings that I think can contribute to the overall safety message, and just retaining top talent because they want to be there and they're comfortable with the safety programs that are in place as part of the larger culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that point about top talent. Those people who are really the high performers and who are also probably going to do some amount of setting the safety culture just for everybody else are going to be the ones who probably care a lot more about that safe operating. Like you mentioned, making sure that you don't have equipment downtime, framing it, again, I think away from fear-based, which is, I think people now in particular in COVID are a little bit more sensitive to that, and just more towards evidence, and kind of a community thing is a great way of doing it.
Yeah, to kind of build off that idea, a lot of times in training and coaching folks in the lab, I always like to make the connection between your safety and protecting your research, because when you're speaking to the scientists, they're so fixated on their research and doing quality research. And so I always try to articulate how important safety is for you, but also for your research. And honestly, like, it's funny. It's like sometimes seeing the light bulb go off, and that's what they needed to hear to really take it seriously. So that's another good one to have in your back pocket, emphasizing that it's about your safety and the safety of everyone around you, but also your product. You want to keep your product safe and have quality research. So,
and your coworkers as well. I think
absolutely.
It's one thing to cause a safety incident that does harm to yourself. It's
right.
Quite another level to hurt someone else because of your non-compliance or actions. So something to consider as well.
Yeah, and being able to demonstrate that buy-in, probably very helpful when you're trying to go up the food chain a little bit and say, hey, this is actually important enough to consider at the first level when we're making these decisions, when we're making our plans. I think that's a great reframe. Definitely, as a past scientist, there really are a lot of people who care more about their science than about their own health and safety. Like, I breathe a toxic fume, it happens. Sure, I stand by my car sometimes too, and I don't care. But something happens to my mouse line that I've been fostering for 6 months, like, absolutely not. Great. So here's a question for both of you that I was curious to hear your views on. What are a few of the most common things that safety professionals might do that could avoid having them be included, or otherwise get them excluded from higher level discussions? I definitely can reflect on earlier times in my own career and all the faux pas that I have made over the course of growing. So what are some of those things that you can kind of maybe look out for and avoid that might hamper progress towards getting a seat at that decision-making point?
Yeah, I could start on this. I think one of the most important things, EHS and safety is so broad, and there are so many things to focus on, that if you don't prioritize correctly and you elevate everything to the level of upper management, you can actually, do a disservice to the program by just nitpicking on every little thing, rather than coming up with the 3 or 4 components of the program that you really want to see improved first, and will make the largest change in the overall safety program. There are some elements that are regulatory and have very little impact on the overall safety. Whereas there are other things that are certainly both regulatory and safety. This is another reason why I don't like the fear argument, because, you know, there are certain elements where, you know, it's a regulatory violation, but the actual impact on the overall safety program is pretty minor. Whereas there are other things that aren't related to any physical regulation, but they may have the largest impact on, you know, the overall safety of the workers. So, you know, it's really difficult if you're only getting into the habit of justifying based on regulatory compliance. You can fall into the trap of not being able to, you know, well prioritize or justify, you know, the recommendations that you're making.
Yeah, I would just add that not listening and understanding the perspective of others is definitely something you don't want to do. It's good to understand what the task is at hand and really think it through completely. Safety isn't one size fits all, is what I always think. There are multiple ways to get to the same end result, and sometimes you have to think outside of the box and be creative and be willing to listen to others and be part of a conversation to get to that endpoint. And I agree about the using the regulations, but sometimes you do have to use that as leverage to kind of make people come to the conclusion or put the money out or whatever it might be. And so it's always good to have that in your back pocket. But yeah, if you're not listening and not, you know, being flexible in some way, obviously not compromising safety, but you have to have some flexibility and at least listening and hearing people out and thinking it through.
Yeah, no, regulatory compliance is definitely a tool in the toolbox, but if it's your only trick, then it gets kind of mundane pretty quickly. Another thing too that I you know, see in a lot of companies is that the safety team is pretty siloed, and they're kind of in their own department and may not have the best access to other departments. And in that context, it can be difficult just to interface with the players that you need to interface with to get meaningful change. And yeah, I love the flexibility. I think if you're not willing to compromise on certain things and come up with the best possible solution, you know, with what you have to work with, I think it can be a struggle. And if you're only black and white on certain things, then it can set you back for sure.
Yeah, the silo point is really important as well. Because if you're not brought into the conversation at the right time, your hands can be tied. And so really, again, if you're not partnered with people and you don't have that relationship, then you're in your silo and you may miss your opportunity. And projects can get to the point of no return and you're stuck. So that's a really good point about silos. Break down those silos, everybody, as much as you can.
Yeah, I think one of the first steps there comes from, I think, like you both touched on, that element of active listening, of listening to understand and not to respond. You know, when we're in the safety world, I think that these problems can feel so big and painful, and that presenting them without the context that makes them relevant to the person who you're speaking with and their problems can just make it seem like you're blowing something out of proportion that actually might be very important, but doesn't match up to what the other person is concerned with and what they're having issues with. And being able to frame that in ways that really kind of hit like right in between the ribs there, you know, into those places can make a big difference for getting somebody to help understand why what you care about is important.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, you know, there is a perception. I've you know, worked with a lot of upper level management and getting through to them about, you know, the extent of the liability, but also not making it only about liability. You know, there are certainly elements where the regulatory element is driving it, and they can see it as something that they can insure out, or that's what workers' comp is for. And, you know, I don't have to really depend on the rest of the safety program, or, you know, again, put upfront expenses to fix it, because that's what those other systems are in place for. And, you know, that's really, again, where culture can be driven, because if you're, you know, viewing it as, you know, workers are just another piece of equipment in the cog, then it's certainly different than, you know, the overall company culture that you want to create. So.
Yeah. Now, before we move on to our next question, I'd just like to remind everybody that we are going to have a live Q&A here at the, you know, about 15, 20 minutes from now. And we'd love to hear your questions, hear about the challenges you're facing, where you feel like your safety concerns aren't being heard, or places where you think, oh man, if I had just had a chance to get into this plan, a couple weeks before, that would have changed everything. Pop those into the Q&A. We'd love to be able to help you troubleshoot your problems, hear your challenges. Robin has also very generously offered to consult with, talk with anybody who would like to meet with her. So feel free to, kind of make a point there. We'll try and get you two connected. You can go down to your Zoom webinar toolbox, click on that Q&A bubble, and then pop your questions in there, and we'll address anything that comes up at the end of the webinar. So just a reminder there. And next question here for you, Corey. So I was wondering if there are a few common places within organizations that safety professionals can look to and find evidence that their efforts contribute to the bottom line. We talked about this a little bit earlier with Liz's comments about the white paper and the lab coat program. But again, returning to this element of going to data and going to numbers rather than sort of talking about soft concepts that might be hard for leadership to grasp.
Sure. Yeah, so again, most of my kind of input is from the insurance world and evaluations that are done there. And I've seen estimates of ROI on safety investment anywhere from $3 to $6 for every $1 spent. So those are pretty good returns. I think a lot of, people in operations would like those returns. I think, again, they're more theoretical, so it's harder to put in, to context and show upfront value. But one of the things that I really highlight for, especially my newer companies who are laboratory based and have hazardous waste is, that's one element. I think chemical inventory and hazardous waste are two elements where if you don't do it well up front, you can drive your expenses quite quickly, depending on how you're managing your hazardous waste and if you're mixing things improperly, or, these are all elements of, safety that I think get captured by your waste disposal costs. And, if you slightly change how you're collecting and disposing of material, there are very real cost savings on that side of the equation that you can realize, and then direct some of the, hopefully the budget doesn't change and you don't lose budget because you've, made cost savings. I personally don't love the putting, hazardous waste disposal costs in the safety bin, because I think that's more of an operations level expense. But because the safety professionals are usually the ones signing the manifests and reviewing the shipments, that tends, in certain contexts, certainly with the early stage biotech groups that I work with, that's really where it's siloed. But also I see so much inefficiency with chemical inventory management and over ordering and bulk ordering things that certainly shouldn't be bulk ordered for a one-time experiment, and then on the back end they're disposing of that material because it's something that they don't use after that one initial experiment or trial run. So yeah, so there's just a lot of elements of cost savings within the program if you know where to look. The one area where I think most people prioritize saving money is in PPE, and I really don't like it because it's so much harder to work on safety glass compliance if you're working with a $1 rigid, really uncomfortable pair of safety glasses. It's just not something that anyone's going to want to wear. So please do not bulk order $1 safety glasses as your cost savings display for the overall safety program.
That last comment really hit home with me, because we have struggled with compliance and wearing safety glasses. And honestly, I felt like one of those salesmen that had the coat with all the different options. I'd show up in the lab and I'd be like, I have 50 options, pick one. And there would always be something that, would be better. I mean, I had a couple folks in the lab that they needed over the glasses because the prescription glasses didn't work. It was just such a challenge, and we finally got a pair that worked. So I ordered extra, and I would get calls for, hey, can I have a pair of those too? But it's true, if it's not comfortable, you're not going to have compliance. So it's so important.
And it's a good way to show engagement too. I've had a lot of success with companies doing demo days and having making a big event about it, like getting samples from multiple different companies and trying them out, and then having people order the ones that they wanted from that. Even the top level safety glasses are not all that expensive. So to try to save $1 or $2 on one individual safety glass pair is just not really where you want the money going, I think.
Yeah, it seems like it falls into the penny wise, pound foolish category a little bit. Oh, yeah. And of course, being able to point to those things and saying, hey, these are really effective. Look at how much this has, improved our compliance rates, getting more buy-in. I think that I really love the framing of looking at safety as a part of operations. Although, Corey, you mentioned kind of in the budgetary portion, making sure those things are a little bit more distinct, but helping people who may be more familiar seeing safety as like just compliance police, understanding no, safety's here to keep things going. Like what happens if you have a huge spill and a room goes down, or a piece of equipment in a core facility goes down or something. Those are very painful experiences depending on what happens. That can be a very easy thing to understand.
Lab fires can be very quick, high dollar amounts depending on what equipment was around that piece of equipment or that fire.
Yeah, even small ones. And the time spent in accident investigation too, that's not negligible. And certainly now during COVID, when on-site time is just so valuable, saying, hey, we've got things that we really have to be doing on site that we can't just, do from, our homes. And it's not a good use of anybody's time to be spending that doing something that's just, it could be avoided. So going back to this topic of silos that we discussed earlier, Liz, the next question for you is when safety is your whole world, it can be kind of hard to understand how other perspectives play into decision making. Do you have any advice or for ways safety professionals can do a better job of educating themselves around topics? So getting more exposure, not just sort of living in their own worlds, but really having chances, especially now with COVID happening, where we're not getting that lunchroom time. We're not getting that one-on-one time or those cross-meeting times to reach out a little bit more, get more exposure, understand more perspectives, and hopefully, craft their value statement and their message a little bit better.
Yeah, I mean, it always goes back to listening and communication and the relationship building. But when I've gotten into situations where, this might be off topic, but I've gotten into situations where I get a lot of pushback or a lot of resistance, the tool I usually pull out is benchmarking. I just, go to the community. The safety community is a really receptive, kind community. Most people are willing to speak with you, exchange emails, to bounce ideas or get, input on how they manage to navigate a particular situation. But definitely benchmarking is huge, because if you can go back, like get a problem, if you have concerns, do some benchmarking and come back to the table with some examples of why it's important, or other options. It definitely is powerful. I can think of a case with a cell sorter, and I was getting pushback from a new PI about the containment that was needed for the cell sorter and the type of work they were anticipating. But I was also trying to be forward thinking. You're not just going to necessarily end here. You might want to do X, Y, or Z, which would increase or change the risk assessment and potentially increase the controls you need. And so I was getting a lot of pushback from this particular individual. And I said, okay, you came from another institution. Tell me who you worked with. And I'm happy to have a conversation and learn about how, the work there is managed and the controls and those sorts of things. Long story short, I went to the 3 resources that were provided to me. And sure enough, their controls and their risk assessment matched what ours was. And the individual I was working with didn't really understand all of those pieces previously. They just went and did their thing or sent their samples in. So once I came back to the table with all of the information I gathered from benchmarking, it was a no-brainer. So benchmarking, I think, is really helpful and can be a valuable tool.
I think one of the things that I think about when I'm evaluating how safety should be interacting with the rest of the organization is, safety is in a unique position in that you interface with both the entry-level employees all the way up and then all the way up through upper management. And in an ideal world, you're really kind of being the go-between and the communicator, and you're facilitating that communication from the bottom up, and then also from the top down. So you hear a lot of safety has to be from the top down, or hazard identification has to be from the bottom up, and it really is two one-sided to say that it's either or. It really has to be a two-way street of communication, and I think that's part of what we're trying to get at here is how do you ensure that both sides of the equation are have an equal voice and are understanding of the level of hazards that are existent throughout the organization. So I think safety professionals could do a better job understanding the business elements of the organization and being able to communicate a little bit better in terms of what's driving the decisions related to productivity, as opposed to what the upper level management may be perceiving as hindrances on overall productivity because of the safety recommendations. Typically what I see is that it's not a hindrance. It's more of a misunderstanding as to what's really going into it. And I think in the long term, you can certainly provide metrics that are showing that your downtime is less, or your productivity has actually increased, and you're retaining that top talent. Again, I go back to that one a lot because I think it's really important as one of those hidden metrics that's hard to measure, and but it's certainly real if you're top talent, especially in the biotech world. It's so competitive for top level employees that if you're not setting yourself up with the right culture, it can certainly be a detriment.
Yeah, just not being afraid to reach out to somebody and send a little bit of a cold email and say, hey, I'm here to learn. I'd like to learn more about what you're doing. I don't know too much about, really what your day-to-day is like. What are the things you're worrying about? I'd like to be able to bring more perspectives into my exercise of safety so I can do a better job. Whether there's a meeting you might be able to join and just sort of sit in on. Great way to make some more friends at your organization too, because, we could all use those definitely in these more isolating times.
Yeah, I think it's also important not to come across as the expert on everything as a safety professional. I think the more you can do to, have other people explain where they're coming from, and then providing feedback rather than trying to be the person with all the answers. If someone is an entry-level scientist, but they're the expert in the organization on how to manage this one piece of equipment, certainly learn from them and help them communicate the level of hazards and involve them in the risk assessment if you're doing one. And at the same time, if you're interfacing with the upper level management, ask questions about what is driving their opinions on certain things. I think it's really important to ask questions as much as you're trying to provide answers from the safety program standpoint.
Yeah, a little bit on that vein, Corey, I was wondering if you could share a story about a time you helped an EHS team or a person get their perspective heard, and then kind of what you did to overcome the challenges that they were facing and help them with that.
Yeah, so this is a very real problem that I see at a lot of institutions is not only how to set up the safety program and establish the safety culture for success, but also how to maintain that for the long run. A lot of these early stage biotech companies are hiring very quickly. And, if you get a big influx of, 20 people and that completely doubles your workplace environment, it can be hard to maintain a consistent safety culture depending on the backgrounds of those new hires and what the, how strong the established culture is. So one of the things that I'm always advocating for is the establishment of a safety committee. And, a lot of early stage companies, particularly in the life sciences, tend to be pretty resistant to a formal safety committee, in my experience. But I view them as, an opportunity to involve all levels of the organization. And, the way they work best is if you have, truly all levels of the organization. So you should have somebody from the C-suite, somebody with, the financial purse string type opportunities who can actually implement the change and see, what the concerns are in real time. It's far more efficient to meet and discuss those, over a 1 hour, it can be quarterly, it can be twice a year, it could be monthly, depending on what the organization needs. But, allowing them to interface directly with the people who are, dealing with the uncomfortable safety glasses or, don't have the right spill materials to clean up certain things, or, it can be something that seems really minor, but until, the upper level managers see it from, the employees who, they're supposed to be protecting and taking care of and are really driving the company forward, it really does change the perspective. So Safety committees are always really important. I think sometimes it's hard to recruit that C-suite member. They're always really busy and they'll come up with some excuses on why they can't participate. But there's always one person that's typically signing off on the permits and licenses for the facility. That's usually the person I target because it's their personal liability that's at stake. There are different ways there. It's usually the operations team member in my experience. It doesn't necessarily have to be C-suite, but if it's, the VP of operations, somebody again with, decision-making power in the organization is always important to have on that committee. Otherwise, you end up just talking a lot about the hazards and, you don't have the power to make the meaningful change that you need in the safety program.
Great. Well, that is just with Liz, if you had any other comments or anything you'd like to share before we move on to the Q&A portion, Corey as well. Any other points you wanted to hit on before we move on?
I think one thing to add kind of to the safety committee and all of that is empowering people. And I think that's kind of what you're getting at, Corey. By engaging people in a committee like that, you empower them to speak up and chime in. And sometimes the language we use around things like safety officer has a certain connotation. One change that I helped implement in a previous position was instead of calling people safety officers or lab safety officers, we changed the title to lab safety leader. Has a totally different feel. It definitely changed people's perceptions of that role, both for themselves and serving in that role. They're a leader now, they're not an officer. And it definitely had an impact. And so, in my current position, we're working on some of those changes now to really turn it into a leadership position, because really at the lab level, at the department level, whatever level or type of organization you have, it is a leadership role, and we should call it that rather than an officer, in my opinion.
No, yeah, I like that a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, great. So before we move on to our live Q&A portion here, just a quick reminder to everybody that Zoom webinar has a Q&A feature. It's really helpful, great way to organize questions, identify the things that you're most interested in by thumbs upping the questions you like. And also you can have side conversations, not just rely on what the three of us are talking about to get more questions answered or to ask for clarification. So before we move on, a quick plug for our upcoming webinars. In 2 weeks, we'll be talking about delivering engaging training during a pandemic. Coming up after that, talking about triaging chemical safety and inventory responsibilities. And then all the way in December, we have one that I'm very excited for, an interview with Luis Alberto Ochoa Carrera. He is a head of, I believe, epidemiological labs for the Mexican Institute of Social Security. I hope I got that right. And he's for a huge organization. He's going to be talking about his experiences managing epidemics and epidemiological surveillance. This is for a group of 60 million people for providing healthcare for them. He's been, involved in epidemic management through, I think, Ebola, cholera, dengue fever, H1N1, a lot of experience there. So really excited to get him on. And also, quick poll for everybody to fill out, please, if you don't mind taking the time. This is the EHS Community Connection webinar. We rely very heavily on our community to keep these going, to understand what topics are most interesting to you so we can keep providing webinars that matter, and also to continue having panelists on these as well. We have Liz and Corey here really kindly offering their time to come on and talk with everybody. And without our panelists, these webinars wouldn't be possible. So if anybody here is interested in being a panelist potentially, if you have anyone in your organization who you think might be a good fit as a panelist, if there are topics you like, please feel free, go ahead, fill out the poll, let us know what you'd like to see. We'd love to keep giving you topics that you are interested in and have, really killer panelists like our current team on to just kind of bring really great discussions here. So I'm going to leave that poll up, and while I do, I'm just going to go ahead and break our normal tradition here and let one of our Q&A askers, Tasha, bring her question live on air to talk about lab coats. So Tasha, you're welcome to come on and unmute and ask Liz your question about dealing with lab coat safety.
Hi, Liz. This is Tasha.
Hi.
Hi. We have several, issues when we come to lab coats. All of our students in anatomy and in microbiology and in cell and molecular have to wear lab coats. First of all is trying to get them to wear the proper lab coat because they have to buy them themselves, and then they have to store them in the lab. And as of right now, we have them storing them in gallon Ziploc bags and sticking them in drawers. The biggest issue now for us is how to let those students take those lab coats home at the end of the semester. In the anatomy lab, we have, we're required to consider the cadavers and everything as biosafety level 1. Plus, we also have the chemical issue with the formaldehyde and phenol. And right now, instructors just allow those students to take them home and wash them in their own washers, which I'm not really for. And in the micro lab, we're a BSL2 lab. And again, the instructors are allowing the students to just take those lab coats home and wash them in their own washing machines. And I'm trying desperately to, at least in micro, have them let me autoclave those lab coats first before they take them home, or try and get a lab coat service to come in there and deal with the lab coats in a more professional manner, which costs a lot of money. So, I mean, how do I mitigate this? What are your suggestions?
So we basically had the same problems prior to our comprehensive campus-wide lab coat program. Basically, I would recommend starting smaller scale, pick your higher risk areas. We started with our biology department teaching labs. We didn't have a good system. Not everyone was wearing coats. It was like very haphazard. We had cases where they were bringing coats home like you're describing, and it was just a lot of red flags. So what we did was we started with a lab coat pilot program. We targeted the higher risk department for the teaching labs, and put together what we had hoped would be our campus-wide program and modeled it there, tried it for a year, and then expanded from there. And that really was like the springboard we needed to get the whole campus engaged. At that time, I'm trying to remember the change in leadership, because we had a leadership change at the provost level, and I just can't remember. I think we managed to get buy-in for the pilot program, but then we were struggling. No, I think actually the leadership change did happen right before the pilot was rolled out. And I think we wrote the pilot so that the campus-wide program would come a year later. So it was a lot of work. Again, I partnered with our college safety officer who had a vested interest in it, got the department involved. It's very complicated because each department and each, teaching labs versus research labs, they're all very different. So it took a lot of effort to work with the different groups to understand what they're doing now, to articulate the hazards associated with that, and then to come up with solutions. Long story short, we started the pilot program using a service, a company that we would rent the coats from. And of course, when you're dealing with teaching labs, you lose a lot of money because they run 12 weeks and then there's a big break. And then, so you're paying to rent the coats for the entire year rather than when you're using them. So we learned our lesson through the pilot. And when we ended up going, we put our RFP together, we had a vendor come back and say, well, instead of renting coats, you could buy them and pay per wash. And you end up, they call it underwash. And so you end up saving a lot of money going through that process. So we ended up buying our own coats, and we have a vendor who launders them. And, we did a cost projection. I don't remember the numbers, but it was a huge cost savings buying our own coats and laundering them because of the underwash. And so we made a case for the campus-wide rollout. So start small, really understand how people are doing things, what the hazards are. And, the white paper really was what did it for us, and getting buy-in and just working with all the key stakeholders and getting them bought into it. But if you wanted to talk offline about this more, I'd be happy to connect.
Yeah, I would appreciate if we could connect offline, because right now we're kind of in a transition stage where we
Hey,
don't.
Tasha, sorry, I'm gonna have to jump in here and just keep things moving along here, but I'll make sure that you and Elizabeth can get connected and have this conversation go on and not get cut off too early. Okay, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your question. We're gonna have another person come on here. This is Alexa. Give me 1 second to just get her unmuted. So yeah, Alexa, feel free to come on and share your question with the rest of us. Oh, sorry, you're coming through a little bit quiet. Could you get a little bit closer to the mic possibly? Oh, I guess this is one of the fun, exciting things about letting people come on. Looks like Zoom is not particularly happy with Alexa's audio, so I'm just going to go ahead here and read her question because I really liked it from the chat. Figured it would be better to hear her own words. So Alexa says, our company has an amazing mission to help those who suffer from rare genetic diseases. It's a powerful mission for our employees, and we're struggling to find ways to introduce safety as something that is important. EHS has been buried in the company, and we're looking for ways to dig ourselves out. We have people working in the labs, but that's not where we've seen injuries or accidents. We've seen much more slips, trips, and falls in vehicle accidents. Since there have been very few issues, I feel like we are the forgotten department and upper management doesn't see us as a valuable team. Any ideas on how we can start something meaningful and get people excited about safety, and examples of what you've done in the past? So sounds like safety is important. Maybe the incidents aren't happening in the lab where they're a little bit higher profile, but these are things that they really want to start building out more, and ideally staying ahead of the curve, right? If you're not seeing any issues, that doesn't mean you should just put safety down. It just means like, let's not have a major accident be the thing that gets our safety team the resources it needs.
Yeah, so I'd love to comment on this one.
Sure.
There are a number of really awesome points in this. I think one is that, again, EHS is really broad. And, if you're only focusing on the laboratory, high hazard, chemical, biological, if you have radiation or lasers, that's where most of the focus is going to go in the safety program. And that's not necessarily where you're going to have incidents. So ergonomic issues, slips, trips, and falls, those are routinely the largest contributors to workplace injuries and workers' comp issues. And so it really has to be more holistic than just involving the lab safety group or the lab employees, and not discussing ergonomics and proper safety with the rest of the organization. The other really important thing that Alexa's mentioning here is it's tough when you're only using incident frequency as your metric for how much you need to invest in safety as the barometer. So I see another question in the chat about KPIs that you use on safety and how to measure it, because incident rate is by far, I think, the least understood and the most random, and it's not something that you want to base your safety investment on, for sure. So certainly involve the rest of the group, highlight the fact that there are ergonomic issues and slip, trips, and falls, and do as much as you can to address those underlying conditions as well. It's the housekeeping, it's the where are spills and condensation and whatnot, and we're getting closer to winter, so there's going to be snow and ice and all that kind of stuff as well. So a lot to consider.
Turns out if you're muted, people can't actually hear your sound. Crazy.
Really?
Yeah. Just to kind of shoehorn into the next question here from Scott, asking about KPIs. Scott wanted to know, are there any suggestions on types of KPIs and metrics that are most meaningful and influential when getting administrators buy-in on safety initiatives? So Corey, you touched on these issues around incidents and how that can be related to safety investment and going down. Is there anything else that both of you or either of you tend to look for when you're trying to point to those data points? You can say, hey, we're benchmarking this, we're seeing this change. This is directly related to these, larger concerns. Any go-tos for you, or any places where you generally look?
So I prefer to turn it from a, I think incidents are very backward thinking and viewing. So, I try to make it more proactive and have it be tied to safety observations or, hazard identification moments, making it so it's more interactive and it's valuing participation over actual incidents. And I think when you do it that way, you can get more buy-in throughout the company.
Yeah, I would have to say taking, inspection findings, taking some of those metrics, right? And looking at them and seeing what the most common findings are, and then finding ways to share that information through safety committees, maybe through monthly postings, just raising awareness around those things to reduce those findings. You can kind of find some leverage and power from the metrics that you're gathering to raise awareness and bring about change as well.
All right, great. Moving on to, oh, sorry, did somebody have another response before I go on? Great, no problem. It's always hard to tell when a breath is a launch in or just, people trying not to suffocate. A question here from Mary. She said, a never-ending challenge, poor housekeeping in academic research labs. As an EHS person, I can't seem to make any progress with PIs on this issue despite taking various approaches and by pointing out that students who go elsewhere will be expected to maintain organized workstations and fume hoods. Any tips? And Liz, I know you as somebody who's worked in both academia and then going into EMD Sorono, and Corey coming from the academic background yourself. That's a common one we hear a lot as well. Just these things of people think, oh, safety is not important, and then they get to industry and realize, oh, if I don't wear my lab coat, that's an issue.
No, it's a really important point. I mean, academia does a great job educating folks, but safety sometimes doesn't fall under the education part of things. And I think it is a failure of academia when we aren't training students about safety and proper housekeeping and all of those things, because they do go out into industry and it could be a big fail because the stakes are much different when you get into industry compared with academia. Having that presence, in the labs, the reminders, that's helpful. I think engaging the lab safety leaders, the people in the department level in your findings and coming up with solutions is going to be important. It's one of those challenges. You just kind of have to keep beating the drum and offer solutions and suggestions and try and be supportive and helpful. But it's one of those things that's just really hard to deal with sometimes.
Yeah, I think there is hold on to as much material as possible, and especially old equipment and old chemicals, even if it's expired, it's going to be useful someday. I do think there is that attitude, especially in academia. I've had success with being the driver of chemical inventory cleanouts and helping them, especially if it's related to fridges and freezers, and just doing an annual cleanout of expired chemicals or materials and really helping them through that process. And then I am a big advocate for lab recycling in terms of old equipment, and there are great programs out there for donating old and used lab equipment. And sometimes when you can show the scientists that their equipment's going to other institutions where it can be used and not just sit in the storage closet, you can really clear out the lab environment pretty well.
Fantastic. And before we move on here, I wanted to make sure I got one other announcement in. We've had a few different requests from attendees for certificates for these webinars for use for continuing education credits, things like that. We are working on that, very close to being done with that. And in about a week or so, we should have certificates for all of the webinars that you've attended available for you to receive and then use. So keep an eye out for that. We're really excited to get those ones going and provide everybody with those certificates that they need. All right. It looks like, Liz, there are a few questions wondering if you could share that white paper you put together on lab coats. Is that something that you might be able to get out into the community?
It might be. It's been a while. I'd have to dig it out. And yeah, probably take out some of the de-identify it, but I might be able to. So feel free to share my contact information, Matt, for people who might be interested. I'll see what I can do, but I'd be glad to talk to people and share whatever resources I'm able to share.
All right, fantastic. Well, I'm looking through the questions here, and it looks like many of these are just comments, things going forward. So I'm just going to go ahead and say that we have really answered all the questions here, and I really appreciate everybody's time. Any closing thoughts or anything you'd like to share before we go? And just want to thank you both again for your time here and for joining us.
Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, thanks so much. This was a lot of fun. And it's good to reflect. We get so caught up in day-to-day craziness that sometimes you don't pause and think about things. So this has been a good exercise.
I never thought PPE would become a colloquial term, so there's certain drivers of safety these days that we didn't have access to before.
Yeah, people really do seem to be much more invested in their own safety right now. And I think it's a rare opportunity for us as safety professionals and in the safety community to use that as a great springboard into other safety conversations and really build some powerful relationships that we can, maybe change the landscape of how things will look for, years to come after this pandemic passes. When that happens, I'm not going to put the if in there. All right. Well, thank you so much. Have a great afternoon, everybody. Hope you have a fun long weekend, and we will see you in 2 weeks for our next webinar on engaging training. And I will thank you all for showing up and for your engagement, and I'll talk with you later.